I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. What you're about to hear is an installment of an ongoing, serialized fantasy narrative that I've written specifically with your ears in mind, with my voice as the only instrument, the only method of delivery, and all done in a single, flawless take. If you haven't listened to part 1 already, you might want to go back and do that now. In fact, if you haven't listened to part 1 already, please, go back and do that now. It's only one episode, and we pick up exactly where we left off last time. Fair warning. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 2. Blessed darkness, a welcome respite, a crushing release. Maul thought himself dead, but knew that he couldn't be so lucky. What's more, his body, though broken and ripped to shreds, was whole. No, Maul's punishment was worse than death. He would never give him that escape. He would see Maul suffer for his betrayal, caught and held in the clenched teeth of that sinister smile. No, Maul's punishment wasn't that inky black void of nothingness. It was something far, far worse, and even more difficult to come back from. It was the utterly shattered, permanently damaged, irrevocably broken psyche that rattled around inside his brain, threatening complete and utter madness with every single excruciating thought. Maul opened his eyes slowly, muscles shaking as he pushed himself up to his hands and knees, his brain struggling to make sense of a reality he thought forever lost to him. For though his mind was broken, in jagged pieces digging into his very being, the fact that he could think at all was a welcome surprise. To the drowning man, even the foulest air is a blessing. But ere Maul could begin to focus on the scene that lay before him, something hard and unyielding struck his jaw, casting him back against a cold stone surface. That sudden jolt of violence, the familiar iron taste of blood in his mouth, it all brought Maul back, and his mind, shattered as it was, managed to piece together that macabre tableau. Cloaked in hooded robes, all in black, the supplicants hovered above him, wielding wicked staves and crooked blades etched in runes from a language lost, relearned, and forgotten again long before the worlds were sundered. They spoke in the old tongue, in the stilted rhythms of debauched ritual, and though Maul couldn't understand every word, he did catch one. It was the one they repeated, blurted, and spat over and over and over again, their hate palpable, their lust throbbing, shouting, chanting, and all the while pointing above Maul's head. So Maul turned and he looked up, knowing full well what he would find there. That smile. Maul leaned against his altar in some forsaken barrier realm, his visage carved in glowing marble, his antlers rendered in solid gold, and the word his devotees bleated in their arcane tongue was sacrifice. Maul's tribe had ruled the plane of man for untold eons, but it wasn't always that way. In the dim light of a new sun, one of Maul's ancestors was better, stronger, and most importantly, willing to go further than any other member of any other tribe. The gore never washed off her hands, and hers became a tribe reared on the battlefield, baptized by steel and suckled by blood. The taste of blood, be it their own or preferably that of their enemies, released something in Maul's people, something dark, eldritch, and older than evil, a ravenous hunger for complete annihilation and the power that comes with being the only thing left standing in a sea of ashes. So despite his aching body, despite his splintered mind, and despite the blood trickling out the side of his mouth, Maul did the only thing he could do. He stood, and he fought. The first supplicant, the one with the gall to strike the true king of men, went down easily. Maul's cudgel connected full on with a crunch that sat down hard in the pit of his stomach, sickening him, but pushing him on to even greater violence. The devotee crumpled instantly, his brain shaken so hard in his skull that he was gone before his body had even hit the ground. Feeling the weight of the cudgel in his hand, pleased by its heft, Maul glanced down, briefly. The dead thing's hood had fallen back, revealing a visage that, though crushed utterly, Maul could see was ancient, wrinkled, decayed. Mothers sang horrible, terrifying songs to their young children, telling of his warrior priests, their mighty hands, and their evil rituals, but this was nothing but a bag of dust and bones. Maul squinted, focusing his eyes in the candlelight. The remaining supplicants circling to surround him were no more robust in their appearance. Though he hesitated to acknowledge them as men, there was more of mankind within them than Maul cared to admit. They were of some hybrid species, one of his perversions, created to worship him and strike fear in those who refused to do the same, with visages that were more bestial than human and grim appetites that would put them at home in the fiercest of jungles. So Maul let out a roar, a battle cry that came instinctively to all the members of his tribe, and he leapt at the nearest supplicant. Unlike his brother, already moldering on the ground, this devotee was ready for Maul's salvo, and he deftly sidestepped his attack. Normally, these debauched zealots would pose no real threat to Maul, but with his mind still piecing itself together from his time in the roiling underneath, Maul was far from his normal self. A fact he realized as the supplicant's curved dagger sunk deep, deep, deep into his flesh. A flesh wound. A flesh wound, nothing more. The supplicants weren't just old. They were frauds. No matter how ancient a warrior might be, no matter how much his skills had degraded, a true warrior, would never sully his blade with such a wasted strike. The attack didn't hit the mark. It didn't hit any mark, but it was not without consequence. The sharp bite of steel shot up Maul's arm and into the oldest, most primal part of his brain. Yes, his mind still hung in tatters from his aching skull, but for this task, Maul didn't need logic. He didn't need planning or strategy or even tactics. He needed one thing and one thing only: rage. Maul twisted with animal quickness, the wicked dagger still embedded in his flesh. Pinning the supplicant's arm to his body, Maul made eye contact with the terrified beast, watching the flash of agony in his eyes as he grabbed his shoulder, held tight, and twisted again, snapping his knobby elbow backward. Maul let the creature fall screaming as two more supplicants rushed toward him, howling his true name, the wicked syllables of which sent bolts of pain shooting into Maul's eardrums. The first supplicant swung wildly, but Maul ducked underneath the haphazardly wielded stave while freeing that twisted runic dagger from his arm. The supplicant, off balance from his frantic blow, stumbled slightly, exposing his inner thigh, a glowing target for a man of Maul's innate martial ability. With a focus belied by the crazed look in his eyes, Maul lunged forward, through the supplicant's tattered robes, through his ancient parchment-like skin, through the deteriorated muscle. Maul could see his femoral artery throb, then spasm, spurt, and fail as that twisted dagger finally found its mark. Moving quicker now, his battle lust taking over, Maul dropped his cudgel and grabbed the rapidly fading supplicant with both hands. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw another aged devotee rushing him, his dagger pointed forward, brandished overhand like a spear. Amateurs, with no idea how to even hold a weapon, much less use one, more comfortable slaughtering helpless calves than facing down a raging bull. Though his mind was split, though his psyche shattered, the strength had returned to Maul's body, and that's all he needed to crush these wicked old demons. Operating on instinct and lizard brain impulses alone, Maul tensed and threw the dying supplicant at his rapidly advancing brother, impaling him on the outstretched dagger and forcing both to the ground. But before they could even make contact with the blood-splattered dirt floor, Maul was upon them, pouncing and landing hard, knocking the wind out of the bottom supplicant. Staring into his panicked eyes, Maul wrapped his blood-stained hands around the devotee's neck, digging into his throat with calloused fingers, bruises appearing as the man gasped, trying in vain to fill his empty lungs. Maul gritted his teeth and he squeezed. He tensed his muscles and he squeezed. He felt the man's windpipe collapse, and still he squeezed, staring him in the eye, a sign of primal respect as his foe slipped into that inky black void of nothingness. As the light left his enemy's eyes, the back of Maul's head exploded in pain. Maul crumpled to the side, lights flashing, obscuring his field of vision, but not so much that he couldn't see the fifth and final supplicant, the devotee forgotten in Maul's bloodlust, standing above him, cackling as he held Maul's own cudgel above his head, poised for another strike, a crushing blow to end it all. And it would be so easy. It would be so very easy to let him, to allow this twisted old zealot to send him slipping softly into death, there to be coddled by the abyss, comforted in a way that he had never known in a life of abduction, imprisonment, and ceaseless, bottomless rage. As the cudgel plummeted down toward him, Maul saw the life he'd lost, the life he'd had stolen from him, the throne that was his birthright, and the power that should have been his, but instead stolen from his home, raised by a race that hated him, that imprisoned for daring to take his rightful place. No, no, no. Maul rose in a flash, extending his hand to catch the cudgel as it fell. The sudden stop rattled the elderly supplicant, who released the cudgel and stood back, realizing that he stared death itself right in its gaping jaws. As the supplicant turned to run, a gesture as futile as it was cowardly, Maul jabbed the club into his abdomen. The supplicant grunted, doubled over, and looked up just in time to see Maul's cudgel swinging down in a wide arc that ended in his neck and a sickening snap. One arm hanging limp and useless at his side, the bones protruding unnaturally beneath his cloak, the first supplicant staggered to his feet, trying to make his way to the temple's heavy stone door, desperate to escape from the nightmare of pain and violence that his unholy house had become. Mere inches away from the thick plank that barred it shut, a sharp pain hit the back of his knee as Maul kicked his legs out from under him. Maul rolled the man over with his foot and knelt beside him. No, please. Please what? Show you mercy? The mercy you were so ready to show me with your pitiful knives? Maul gripped the cudgel in both hands, squeezing hard enough to lose feeling in his fingers. He commanded it. We had no choice. I had no choice. Panicked tears welled up in the supplicant's eyes. You made your choice. You made your choice long ago. You signed the pact. You threw in with him. Maul raised the cudgel high above his head. Please, just let me go. I won't say a word. I'll disappear. I promise, I'll disappear. Maul grimaced. He wrinkled his nose at the cowardice he smelled. You lived evilly, but you can still die well. The supplicant let out a final gasp as he recognized a familiar smile on Maul's face. Then the cudgel crashed down, sending him into that inky black void of nothingness. The first strike did the job. It left a crushed, bloody, gurgling mess, only living by the most lenient definitions of the word. But Maul wasn't through. He raised the cudgel again and again. Again and again it crashed down, smashing into what was left of the supplicant's face. The nauseating thud of wood hitting bone, of bone hitting the ground, of wood battering the earth, of gore splattering outward. Maul was a thing possessed, the agony of a decade bursting out through his blood-soaked hands, howling as he gazed down at his handiwork, as the supplicant's shattered skull brought to mind them. Brought to mind what he'd done to them and for him, and now what he had done because of him. The battered red mess that used to be a face wasn't the supplicant's. It was that of the royal families. The royal family that had imprisoned him, but also, no, never, don't look back. The throne, eyes to the throne, to your throne. Please don't, focus. Eyes to the throne, eyes on the prize, but the throne is coated in gore and the blood is, no. Maul's head spun. The adrenaline faded away and his bloodlust abandoned him, leaving a man as broken as he was dangerous, his will hobbled by acts as heinous as they were fruitless, his mind infested with lunacy from a moment in the underneath that lasted an eternity. The room spinning, the hot iron scent of freshly spilled blood filling his nostrils. Maul clutched his cudgel. He cast aside the plank and he fell, gibbering wildly against the heavy stone door, forcing it open and stumbling out into the cool, fresh night air. It was dark. Maul instinctively looked to the sky to determine the time, but in this strange new world, with no knowledge of its stars, he could glean nothing. His temple was housed in an unremarkable, unassuming spot, a portal designed to escape notice in an alley that was best to hold your breath and walk quickly past. Just as well. Maul gently and quietly closed the heavy stone door, locking in the gruesome scene that it contained. Reeling from the sudden lack of adrenaline, from the quick, ferocious battle with the supplicants, from the senses-shattering experience of the unchecked underneath, and most of all, from the searing, inescapable guilt over what he'd done for him, Maul staggered out into the street, scanning, looking, searching for something, anything that would tell him where he was, how to get to his homeworld, or what his next move could possibly be. He still couldn't tell what time it was, but he knew that it was late, as the only movement on the street was furtive, scandalous, and violent, even for a neighborhood such as this. Suddenly, Maul realized that the gnawing in his stomach wasn't guilt, or wasn't just guilt. It was something more. Though he knew himself to have not grown older, Maul had no real idea how much time he had spent in the underneath. Time flowed differently there, as it did on all of the Sundered worlds, and while he didn't think it had been terribly long, the growling in his stomach told him differently. Not wishing to collapse, not wishing to send a message of weakness to the ominous shadows moving about the street, Maul leaned against a soot-stained stone wall and closed his eyes briefly. Or so he thought. Friend, you can't sleep here. It's not safe. The scratchy voice whispered, near a state of panic. Suddenly, Maul was awake again. His eyes shot open. It couldn't have been for more than a moment, but the voice was right. In this neighborhood, a moment was all you needed to wake up with empty pockets and a slit throat. Maul saw the source of the voice, a gnarled, knobby creature with pained eyes, hunched up and cowled to little more than half of Maul's own height. But though short in stature, Maul's keen eyes saw something else. This creature was once something more, something better. He possessed a warrior's build, albeit one bent and broken from a lifetime on his knees, but still. Maul saw something of himself, or rather, something of a self that could have been, and he pitied the monster. It's not safe for you at all, the beast repeated, nervously looking over his shoulders. How did you come to find yourself here? Maul tried to tell the monster, tried to articulate all that he had done, all that he had seen, tried to describe the bright, shining horrors of the underneath, the mind-breaking truths and the reassuring lies that all of reality is built upon. Maul tried to form the words, but though his tongue and lips moved, the voice would not come. A man tired of being denied what he wanted, what he deserved, Maul persevered, but as he tried to force his story out, his tenuous grasp on sanity began to give way, his mind splitting and splintering as that roiling darkness crept up around the sides of his vision. The beast slapped Maul's cheek. Hey now, none of that. Focus now. My name is Rorg. And yours? It's Maul. I'm sorry. Hunger. I need to eat. The beast frowned knowingly. And from the look in your eyes, you need something else as well. Rorg took Maul's arm, looping it over his broad, bunched-up shoulders, and gently propelled him down the dark city street as swiftly as possible. Struggling to stay conscious, Maul mumbled, Where are you taking me? To my home. Though it's humble, it will still offer some protection from what the night holds. Food? Yes, and food. I will not have a man starve to death under my roof. I have not forsaken every code, just yet. Now quiet. Save your strength. Maul dozed in and out of consciousness, his mind begging for sleep, his body begging for sustenance, his feet dragging forward only under protest. Rorg led him to his home, little more than a hovel, really, a lean-to under a bridge surrounded by the tents and filthy nests of beasts even less fortunate than Rorg. A rat-like creature scrabbled around the door, but Rorg sent it screeching off into the night with a clumsy kick from his bare foot. He reached into the rags tied around his neck and found a key. He unlocked the door and led Maul inside. If, from the outside, Rorg's hovel looked filthy, once inside, it was squalid. The walls were thick enough to keep the stench in, but too thin to keep out Rorg's howling neighbors, or the howling wind which had been picking up as the night wore on. Beggars can't be choosers, though, especially when near faint in an unknown land, and besides, once Rorg had his meager fire going, the hovel was bearable, if not exactly cozy, and the smoke even managed to cover up the stench. After piling Maul with blankets made mostly of holes, Rorg set to work on their supper. It was thick, lumpy, gray, and possessing of an odor that assured Maul he was better off not asking after its ingredients. Maul was far from the trusting type, but with his head spinning, his stomach churning, his body aching, and no clue where he was or how he might begin to make his way to his home realm, Rorg's hovel was a welcome port in a raging storm. Rourke served Maul, as across all realms the bond of host and guest was a hallowed one, even in this barrier realm, a place between places. Rourke then served himself, and the two sat, shoveling the viscous porridge into their maws, barely taking time to breathe, much less speak. After emptying their bowls, Rourke silently, deftly tended to Maul's flesh wound, then filled Maul's bowl once again so he could begin tucking in, this time at a slower pace. Rourke squinted at Maul. I know the look in your eyes, the look of loss, of pain, of anguish. Maul started to reply, but Rourke held up a gnarled hand. No. I know it well. Too well. For I suffer it myself, and I see my suffering in you, friend Maul. Rourke reached into a small, worn wooden box and retrieved a mortar and pestle, the only clean things in the entire hovel. Reaching into his rags, he pulled out a leather pouch that he carefully emptied into the mortar, taking pains not to waste a single leaf of the fragrant plant matter within. I know you for a warrior, and though I don't look it now, I too used to sate my desires on the battlefield. But though I shrugged off wounds that would cripple a normal man, though I choked down pain that would bring heroes to their knees, and though I charged into the face of almost certain death, none of it compares to what ails me now. Rourke nodded slowly as Maul replied, What befell you, Rourke? Gently but firmly, Rourke's gnarled hands worked at the mortar and pestle, grinding the herbs into a fine powder, releasing their fragrance of lilac, warmth, and forgetfulness. Your mind is already tormented by trauma. It is not my place to throw fuel on that raging fire. So save my story for another day, and instead allow me to offer you release from the agony you endure. Rourke slid closer to Maul, placing the mortar between them, then smiled gently. Will you join me, Maul? Will you partake of that holy plant we call the anchor, that divine salve of the mind, the crutch that eases the wise man's burden? Rourke had rescued Maul from a grim fate on the streets, had welcomed him into his home, had shared what little he had, and he had seen Maul for what he was. A warrior set adrift, tossed and battered by the storms of his mind. Now, this wretched creature, who clearly had been through far worse than even Maul, offered him an anchor. Something to hold him down, to help him focus, to allow him to weather the storm, right his ship, and sail onward. Would he accept? How could he not? Maul nodded, as Rourke knew he would, and the old warrior, twisted by wounds both inside and out, let a smile creep across his pitted countenance. Reaching for a pair of tongs with shocking alacrity, he picked out a glowing coal from the fire and placed it gently in the mortar, igniting the plant matter with a hiss of smoke. At Rourke's urging, Maul joined him, leaning in, placing his face over the mortar and breathing in deeply, easing his mind with the scent of lilac, warmth, and forgetfulness. The sensation flooded his brain, smoothing the rough edges of his shattered psyche, warming him from the inside out and clearing his mind of the nightmare his life had become. Leaning back, Maul smiled, mouthed the words "thank you" to Rourke, and drifted off to sleep, collapsing into the darkness of a dreamless slumber, his first true rest in more than a decade. Maul awoke calmly, the cobwebs of a night of deep sleep falling away at the sound of the city coming to life. Rubbing his eyes, he saw Rourke, already awake and hunched over a new pot of gruel, stirring methodically. Maul allowed a rare smile to creep across his lips as he realized that while still aware of what he'd done, and what he must do still, he was no longer tortured by that knowledge, no longer ravaged by the scents he saw, the sights he felt, and the emotions he smelled in that roiling underneath. They were not fully healed yet. Rourke had treated his injuries, both his broken mind as well as the freshly wrapped wound on his arm. Maul sat up and began to greet Rourke, but immediately doubled back over. While his mind was vibrant, his body was far from it. Every joint cracked and ached, while his bones themselves seemed to cry out in agony. What's happening? Everything. It hurts. Rourke turned to Maul and smiled sadly. It's true. The first morning after is always the most painful, even with a half dose. The pain will never leave you, but you'll grow accustomed to it, as I have. Maul, aware of the pain, ready for it now, forced himself up. He gritted his teeth, hoping that if he bit hard enough, the pain would give up and go away. You knew this would happen? Why didn't you tell me? Because you never would have taken the anchor with me. But how do I make it go away? How do I fix it? The anchor, the divine salve, it's the only cure. And that's it? I must now take this anchor again and again just to stave off this agony? For how long? How long must I suffer like this? Rourke frowned, averting his eyes. You must suffer as all men do, until your dying breath, when the anchor finally drags you beneath the ground. Maul, that familiar rage boiling up inside of him, searched for the only solution that he knew never failed. He grasped his cudgel tightly, freeing it from the makeshift loop that held it to his waist. What have you done to me? I trusted you. Rourke, why would you do this? Please, understand. Gradoon, he sells the anchor. He knows the state I'm in. He exploits it. He knows what I've become. He knows that my threats, they're as empty as my pockets. I need your help. You're so strong, so imposing. I thought, before Rourke could finish croaking out the words, Maul was upon him, for though Rourke was a trained warrior at one point, that was long ago, and Maul, even in physical agony, still possessed the sinewy quickness and strength of a jungle cat. He slid around Rourke, cinching his cudgel against the wretched creature's neck, pushing aside the folds of decaying skin to close off the air to Rourke's withered, wheezing lungs. You thought to turn me into your attack dog, but you didn't stop to think what would happen if I turned my snapping jaws upon you? Rourke coughed, his entire body shuddering with the effort. You can't. You mustn't. You mustn't kill me. And why is that? Maul roared, primed and ready to close the 1-inch gap that separated Rourke from that inky black void of nothingness. Why should I spare you? Because who else will lead you to the anchor? If you enjoyed what you just heard, I hope you'll check me out on social media. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they're all just Aubrey Sitterson. AubreySitterson. No spaces, no numbers. Or you can head over to aubreysitterson.com, spelled the same way, for links to everything, including social media, my non-SKALD related projects, t-shirts, credits, bio, and contact information. Finally, if you're enjoying SKALD, please tell your friends, in real life, online, anywhere you can find them. Huge thanks are in order to Tommy Smith, the talented dude behind SKALD's amazing album art, and Mike Bamonte, whose help has been invaluable when it comes to making this podcast sound as good as possible. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.